And this is what we're doing today. We're looking at kind of one very central, and this is something we've been encountering all along, but this is going to make it a bit more systematic, namely assumptions. When do you need to add them into an argument? How do you need to add them into an argument? And how do you evaluate more complex arguments that involve assumptions? And this is what we did in the very first tutorial, right? In the very first tutorial we looked at, when we looked at the philosophical example of the week, this classical argument that says, you know, it's absolutely impossible to have any kind of argument that doesn't rely on assumptions at some point or other. And if that were the whole story, then this would be an absolutely futile lecture, right? Because there would be no practical point. It wouldn't be possible to actually put all of the assumptions on the table. So the trick is going to be figuring out which ones are relevant and which ones aren't. So first of all, they're everywhere. That kind of is an argument for taking assumptions seriously and looking at this. We will kind of be coming back to cognitive biases and cognitive illusions and stereotypes and that type of thing in the very last lecture. So assumptions, implicit assumptions, are also often at the root of stereotypes that you have and kind of making them explicit. So making yourself aware of which assumptions you're making but never actually knew you were making or thought you were making can not just help improve arguments and also evaluate other people's arguments, but can also kind of protect you potentially from these types of pitfalls. So we'll see that later. And finally, it's, as I was saying, a really powerful strategy for criticizing other people's arguments or seeing how good they are, not always criticizing in a bashing manner, of course. So let's look at one toy example of a problem, concrete debate, right? Well, toy example of a debate where implicit assumptions would be relevant. If you look at these two claims, these two people are saying almost exactly the same thing, right? They both agree on the context. There are difficult times. There's a chairman who has been active for 10 years. They disagree on whether or not this chairman should be reelected. And one way of reconstructing this is to say that the difference between these two views actually depends on two more general assumptions that are being made but are not being made explicit. So to decide this type of toy debate, one would actually have to put those assumptions on the table. So it could be something like this, right? It could be something like a general claim, in difficult times you do or you don't replace somebody who has a lot of experience. So that could be the type of thing it hangs on. That could be the type of principle that they're both implicitly assuming, and making that explicit might actually help them progress from kind of this stage to a more constructive one. So that would be one way, just one kind of initial way of engendering interest in this. So here's our definition. So again, as so often is the case for argument and claim and so on and so forth, we're going to be using assumption in a slightly more technical sense, right? It's not going to be just any kind of assumption as we would be talking about in everyday language, but we're going to use assumptions really to refer to statements that aren't explicit in an argument, but that would have to be made explicit in order for the conclusion to follow. So that in some sense are going to be required to get really a complete and valid argument whose truth needs to be taken for granted to show that we can actually get to the conclusion. So that's going to be the slightly more technical sense in which we're using that. And one thing that you can kind of immediately see here then is that there is often a little bit of wiggle room as to what implicit assumption is being made, right? And what you can see here, actually implicit in this definition, is that you have to, or you should strive to be somewhat charitable when reconstructing assumptions, right? So you should try to reconstruct, if you say an argument depends on an assumption, try to find an assumption that would make, if it were made explicit, that would make the argument valid. Then you can see whether that assumption is true or not, right? But you don't want to, for instance, think that your opponent is making some kind of assumption that would just lead to an obviously invalid argument or anything like that. So some aspect of charitability is needed here. So let's look at that, right? What we're doing right now, well, maybe this is or isn't an ordinary lecture. That is up for debate. But let's say a lot of research shows ordinary lectures are just terribly inefficient, not a good method of teaching, so universities shouldn't use them. What kind of assumption is being made, or what more general claim is being made here in the background that is really needed to turn this into a complete argument? Does anybody have that? Yeah. Ordinary lectures are boring. Mm-hmm. Which would seem to be similar. That's a universal truth, right? Ordinary lectures are just painstakingly boring. Nicholas?
If a method of teaching is found to be ineffective, we should replace it with a more effective method.
So some sense, so I think one way to say this is there are, so one could say things about lectures being boring, learning outcomes, and so on and so forth, and those might all flow into this first premise, right? So what does it mean to be inefficient? But for here, what we need to really turn this into a complete argument is actually something that's going to link that first premise to the conclusion, right? So something about universities actually being supposed to use effective methods, or at least not to use ineffective ones, right? So that seems to be a general principle that is needed to fill in that gap. Yeah? Okay. So what we can also see then from this toy example is that we are now getting an argument that has linked or codependent premises, right? So that's why, or kind of another way of seeing that this is the premise that we need at this level. More would be needed to show that each premise is true, or what exactly it means. But these two together are really needed in a linked way to get that conclusion off the ground. Yeah? So that comes back to what we were saying about linked and independent premises. And here's something else just to consider in thinking about assumptions. So here's a bit of a more complex and a bit of a more loaded example of an argument. So Peter Zinger's reconstruction question about stem cell research, and then quoting Bush, Bush's claim that he kept, in thinking about these issues, returning to these questions. So are frozen embryos human life, and therefore are they something precious to be protected? Which seems to be kind of an implicit kind of a form of argument as well. So that's what it would be. So what would be the implicit assumption in this one? Again, if we're following the rule that we just had, yeah?
Human life to be protected.
So something about human life having to be protected, right? So that would make sense. Again, those would be linked premises, and those together would support the conclusion. But this is where it gets tricky, right? Because there you also have somebody who supports the death or supported the death penalty. So how do those fit together? So sometimes the message is supposed to be, it's also important, especially when thinking about your own implicit premises, to kind of think beyond the argument itself, right? So there's one question that can be asked: what type of premise, what type of additional assumption is needed to turn an argument as evaluated on its own into a valid argument? And for that purpose, this would be perfectly sufficient, right? So if we just look at the argument on its own, this would work. But if we look at it in a larger context, then we suddenly get contradictions with other positions. And that's, again, why it's so important to kind of spell that out and really be aware of what one is assuming and what broader views one is committed to, right? So in that case, we would need to make this more specific by adding something about innocence and so on and so forth. And then, of course, at some point saying what one actually means by that, which then gets even trickier. Just to say sometimes it's important to look beyond the individual argument into the broader context. So that was just really the general sales pitch, why you should be interested in implicit assumptions. But now we don't really know yet how to reconstruct them, and that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to do next. Any questions at this point? Good. So what we're now going to do is look at kind of 3 rules that you can use for, first of all, figuring out whether an implicit assumption is being made and how to figure out which one that is. The rabbits will make sense in a minute. So first rule for identifying assumptions, or actually for knowing whether an assumption is being made, is the lonely premise rule, right? If you have an example of an argument that has just one premise, that is a kind of signpost that there probably is at least one, maybe even more, implicit assumptions being made there in the background. This is not a fail-safe method, right? There could be arguments that depend on a single premise where no additional assumption is needed, so this might not be strictly true in all cases.
In what cases would that happen? Like, how could you have one premise leading to a conclusion for another?
It would be famous example. How many people here have done TSM, Fill of Mind? So the cogito ergo sum, right? That would be an example where some people say, Descartes, how do I know that I exist? And he seems to be saying, and people can't agree over what exactly and how exactly to reconstruct it, but some people think that's a single premise. I'm aware of my own existence right now. I'm aware of myself as a thinking thing, directly leading to a conclusion without a general premise. And it's not really clear whether he's entitled to that, but that could be one example. For your purposes, almost always when there's a single premise, there will be something additional needed. So for your purposes, for our purposes here, you can kind of ignore that problem. What is more important for your purposes is that if there's a lonely premise, there's probably a missing assumption. But if there is not a lonely premise, that does not mean that there are no implicit assumptions involved, right? So even if there are 2 or more premises, there might still be additional assumptions to reconstruct. So handle that one with care, but it's a good first indicator. And that's, of course, exactly what was going on in our example. And this is where the rabbits make sense. So this is the justification for the rabbit pictures, the rabbit rule. Rule number 2, how do you know kind of what type of assumption to reconstruct, and how do you take it from there? Well, one indicator is going to be if there's something surprising that turns up in the conclusion almost out of nowhere, as if being pulled out of a magician's hat, right? If something like that is happening, then that signals implicit assumptions, and that also gives you some indication of what that assumption is going to have to be, right? So in this case, we seem to have 2 kind of significant phrases in that conclusion. So something about what about universities generally, which isn't even there in the premise, and something about what they should or shouldn't do, right? So that was kind of exactly the rule that we were using to reconstruct that assumption. So that's rule number 2. And then rule number 3 is the wonderful feel-good hippie type rule, right? Holding hands, your premises have to be also linked in some sense to each other, right? It's not enough that they aren't lonely, aren't on their own, but they also have to be connected. And for our purposes, that's going to mean that if you have any relevant concepts that don't appear in the conclusion, so concepts that were originally in the premise but then somehow dropped out, right, that didn't make it down to this level. So this is also the mirror image of the magician's hat. That's kind of the disappearing act that happens here. If something like that is going on, then a second premise is needed where this concept will turn up again, right? So relevant concepts, in other words, have to turn up twice, at least, in an argument, namely either in both premises or in one premise and the conclusion. And again, you can see this here, right? Ineffective methods of teaching have dropped out, so that's the thing that needs to be restored. And then the way you do that is you just basically mark out any of those phrases that you've identified. And once you've done that, you can just kind of paste them together and get exactly what we've done. And as always, you might be wondering at this point, well, if we could solve this intuitively, why do we have to spend so much time sort of going through the rules? This is just another case where I think it's easy to solve this and to implicitly use the rules in this kind of a case, but it gets more difficult and tricky in other cases. So, so it's still good to kind of use those rules and know how you're applying them. All good at this point. So you can kind of use the dorky rabbit example to remember what you're doing here. Okay, so let's look at a more complex, slightly more complex example. So, freedom of speech is crucial in democracy because discussions of candidates are essential for voters to make informed decisions during elections. So you start out by finding the conclusion. So, what would the conclusion be here? Quite obviously.
Freedom of speech is crucial in any democracy.
So our first sentence, yeah, exactly. So that would be the conclusion. That also tells us what the premise is, namely the thing that came at the back. Thanks. And this is going to be an example where we actually have two premises or two implicit assumptions that need to be added. Maybe you can take 2 or 3 minutes and look at it and think what those missing premises might be. So to apply the rules that we just had. So why is this an interesting example, or what is the work that has to be done here? And why might there be an indication that two things are needed aside from the fact that I have put A1, A2 and A3 there?
None of the concepts mentioned in premise 1 are in the conclusion?
Yeah, so they have all dropped out. And the same is true for the conclusion, right? That seems to employ concepts that just came out of nowhere that weren't directly linked to that. So that would be some indication that there are kind of 4 different elements that need to be combined here to make sense of it. Yeah? Good. So what would we link up then here to get our argument off the ground? So these are kind of our candidates then, in other words.
Well, A2 could be open discussions of candidates is freedom of speech, or at least part of freedom of speech. And or freedom of speech is needed to have open discussions with candidates, and that voters
So that one might be better, right? Something like freedom of speech is essential, right, for open discussion. That would be the closest thing that we would have to that wording, because that would keep the essentiality in the premise or whatever. So that's probably the best way to go.
And
Yeah.
voters being able to make informed decisions is needed for a democracy.
Yeah. So that would nicely keep that structure, right? So that would nicely keep the logical structure there and link those two things, right? So we would get something like this. And then you can suddenly see exactly how that will lead on to the final conclusion, right? Because we've now established basically all those links. Does that make sense, that example? Any questions? Okay, good. So that would have been one of the slightly more complex examples, and here you can again see that we now suddenly get move from an example that has just a single premise to one that is actually linked to two additional assumptions. And just to kind of flag, I think I forgot to mention this earlier, just to kind of flag the difference between assumptions and premises, we're just going to typically mark them as A2, A3, so we're going to keep the numbering from the premises, but just put an A in front of that to signal that it's actually an assumption. Okay, so one issue with this type of thing is that I no longer see what comes next. So what conclusions? So sometimes it's also the case if we have, or put differently, what premise needs to be assumed for this type of example? And again, there could be several that are roughly fitting with the example, but there's only going to be one that is strictly needed. So the number of visits to hospital emergency rooms by heroin users is proportional to the incidence of heroin usage. And only if we had that, right, we could actually say that there has been a rise. Because otherwise it could just be that it's the same, more people are actually visiting the emergency room, or more people are identifying themselves, and so on and so forth. So this would actually be, for our purposes, the one that would really be needed to turn this into a valid argument. And again, you can also see that kind of these or additional ones might be needed to support, for instance, in the form of sub-arguments or something like that, to lend additional support to individual premises, but these two would be needed to really lead to the conclusion. Yeah? Okay. So that sums that up. That's just the squash version of the 3 rules that you can go back and look at if you want to be reminded.